Hello and welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. My name is Clarissa Benfield. I am our global business leader for our medical and laboratory business here at Intertek. And today I am so thrilled to be joined by Sharmila Gardner from our UK team. Sharmila, thank you so much for joining me. How are you today?
Fine, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, so excited to talk all things UKCA today. But maybe to kick us off and get us started, you can give a bit of an introduction to yourself and how you fit into our Intertek overall business.
Okay, so I'm Sharmila Gardner. I'm the head of the UK approved body and for medical devices, and we've recently been designated as the UK approved body. And yeah, obviously excited and thrilled to be here to talk about the scheme.
Yes, we're very excited that we have gotten our status right to be an approved body in the UK for UKCA for medical devices. And I know there's, of course, been a lot of questions surrounding this. And one of the big questions that come up that we see a lot, right, with this new idea of UKCA marking is really, how does this differ from what people are already doing for the CE mark, for the European approval? What is the difference, right? What are people looking at here when we're talking UKCA versus CE?
Okay, so CE marking obviously enables medical devices to be placed on the EU market. So UKCA marking is the route to the market for the Great Britain market. So it's a consequence of Brexit, that B word. Yes. So obviously as a consequence of Brexit, the UK has kind of started diverging and doing its own thing.
Yeah, which is, exciting in a lot of ways, right? It's going to be great for our medical device industry, right? Everyone is going through this process with the update to the MDR anyways. So there's a lot of new requirements. So having this kind of happen at the same time, although it's slightly different from CE, right? It does make sense that we're kind of moving in this direction at the same time. And what I think is most interesting, and I've heard a lot of questions from medical device manufacturers that we currently work with, is there's been a lot of rumblings about, oh, the UKCA mark is no longer going to be required, or there's an extension period, or what does it actually mean for medical device manufacturers? With all of the announcements that have been made, when is it required for a medical device manufacturer to comply with the UKCA requirements?
So the requirements in the UK have kind of been put off a bit. So to tie in with the EU extension of allowing MDD certificates, devices certified under MDD certificates to still be marketed. The UK has also allowed that extension as well. So obviously how long you have to apply UKCA marking depends on whether the manufacturer has an MDD or MDR certificate and what the device classification is. So medical device manufacturers with valid MDD certificates can place their devices on the Great Britain market until the end of 2027 if those devices are class 3 or class 2B implants under an MDD certificate, or until the 30th of June 2030 if the devices are under an MDR certificate. And then mostly for all other classifications of device, they have until the 30th of June 2028 on an MDD certificate and the 30th of June 2030 on an MDR certificate. So it's a little bit complex. Obviously, all of those dates are available on the MHRA website. Obviously, if you're a manufacturer, just look at your classification and what certification you have, and you'll know what your extension period is.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense, right? That we have these new deadlines, especially if people have already gone through the MDR or going through the MDR process. What if someone wants to go to UKCA now, though, and go that route, even if they already have an existing MDD or have an existing MDR? Are they able to go now as of today for
UKCA
of course,
approval? Yeah, okay. We're a UK approved body open for business. So yeah, of course, we're taking on applications at the moment. All you have to do is obviously approach us. Depending on what certification that you have, our technical planning group will obviously assess what is required for that, to obtain UKCA marking. There may be audits, there may be assessments. It really depends on how long ago we may have assessed that product, and obviously whether your scopes for the EU and UK align or not.
Yeah, and that makes sense. So you can use the extension of your CE marking for MDD MDR if you would like to. You can go to UKCA now if you're ready and would like to. You reach out to one of these approved bodies. As we know, we are one, and there's a handful of others that have already gone through this process and are approved bodies for the UK. And so then it's a similar process to what we see from the notified body side for MDR. Someone approaches you, they have to fill out information, they provide all of their technical details. Perhaps there's an audit, perhaps there's just an assessment. and then they go through that process for UKCA.
Yeah, and obviously there are some manufacturers that only sell to the UK market. So, for them, obviously CE marking doesn't make sense, and they can swap completely to UKCA marking.
And I think we should mention too, we shouldn't fail to mention, right? We have a lot of people who listen to our podcast that are from all over the world. So maybe remind everybody where UKCA applies when we talk about Great Britain, right? What that actually means geographically, so everyone remembers.
Okay, so obviously the UK is England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. But because of Brexit, the Northern Ireland still functions under EU rules. So UKCA marking really applies to England, Scotland, and Wales.
Yeah, so good for people to remember, right, too, when we're thinking about geography, exactly where this is going to apply. And I think especially when people are preparing their regulatory strategies, right, looking at Europe as a whole, plus, the Great Britain area, right, making sure that they're understanding what they need to do to meet the requirements for each.
Yeah.
I
was going to say that it's still important to remember that if manufacturers are selling into the Great Britain market, they still have to register their products here with the MHRA, and they have to, if they're not based in the UK, they have to appoint a UK responsible person.
And maybe we should talk a little bit about this, because this is regardless of whether or not they're using the CE extension or whether they're going straight to UKCA, they still have to register, and they still have to have a UK designated person. So registration process, pretty straightforward with MHRA. Maybe you can talk a little bit about this UK designated person and who that person can be or has to be. Yeah,
so the UK responsible person is very similar to the EU authorized rep. So they perform the same kind of functions. They obviously make sure the manufacturer is doing the right thing. They can also be responsible for registering. They have to keep a copy of the technical file, the declaration of conformity, and a copy of the UKCA certificate. They liaise with the regulator, and also they inform the manufacturer if there are any complaints with the product.
And this person has to be physically located within the UK.
Called a person, but obviously it can be a company. But yes, they're physically located in the UK.
Physically located within the UK and be that responsible person. So I think that's really important for people to remember that, yes, it may sound great that you can keep this CE extension and still be using your CE marking, but that doesn't prohibit you from having to comply with the MHRA registration and then having this responsible person. Right. Yeah. So the other thing that I think comes up a lot as well, right, when people are doing their regulatory planning and regulatory strategies, is looking at the fees that are associated with the UKCA marking itself. Is there a fee structure that exists currently for UKCA marking?
There is. It's kind of similar to the EU. There's an application fee. Obviously, there are fees for the audits and assessments required initially, and then to maintain certification. There's also an annual management fee to cover any work we do to maintain the certification. So, admin, project management, and review and vigilance. So, yeah, I can't give you the exact fee structure, but obviously it follows those lines. It depends on what's required to initially achieve certification, and obviously to maintain it, it's very similar to the EU. It also depends on whether the manufacturer also has existing MDD and MDR certification, because obviously if they do, the fees are less, they're reduced if they're in addition to existing certification, but whereas they're higher, obviously, if it's UKCA certification only.
Definitely, that totally makes sense. So I think too, some of the other things that come up, because everyone's kind of navigating this process with new MDR requirements plus UKCA requirements, are there essential requirements for UKCA compliance? Are there special labeling requirements for UKCA marking? What should people be aware of in terms of what they need to be preparing?
Okay, so obviously when the UK left the EU, the EU MDR hadn't really come into effect, so it wasn't retained in law. So a bill was passed to give effect to the UK law to the EU directive. So really the MDD, AIMDD and IVDD is what we're currently using as the regulatory framework. So the essential requirements are exactly the same as the essential requirements in the EU MDD.
I think that's important for people to remember too, because sometimes you hear people referring to like UK MDR, but they're really following the MDD from CE, right? Those guidances that came from MDD, AIMDD, and IVD, right? So I think that's important to remember the distinction. As with everything in medical, as we're very used to, there's tons of acronyms, tons of names for things, and they always sort of align, but maybe not necessarily 100%. So
the
I think
UK MDR 2002, the part 2 is the MDD, part 3 is the AIMD D, and the part 4 is the IVDD. So that's how they align, really.
Yeah. And I think that's really important for people to remember. And then with the specific labeling requirements for UKCA, do people have to label their products differently twice separately if they're shipping to EU and the rest of UK? How does that work from a labeling standpoint?
So obviously, if they're still relying on CE marking, no difference at all. Okay. But if the manufacturer applies for UKCA marking, then obviously, depending on the classification, they need an approved body or not. And then they would affix the UKCA mark in exactly the same way that they fix the CE mark. Obviously, if an approved body is used, you've got to use the approved body number, and ours is 8532. So you would see that next to the UKCA mark, and obviously you also have to put the UK responsible person on either the labelling or the instructions for use.
Oh, that's an interesting distinction too. So you put that within the label or within the IFU.
Yeah, it's similar to the way you would use the EU rep as well. So no difference to that. But that's only required for UKCA marking. So not not for CE marking.
Yeah, perfect. And then the other thing that's come up quite a bit when we're looking at the transition from the MDD to the MDR, and I think questions come up about UKCA as well, are the post-market surveillance requirements and any vigilance requirements. Are they the same? Are they different? Because I know that's a big kind of burden for a lot of medical device manufacturers as they're looking at this transition to the MDR. Are they looking at the same thing with UKCA in terms of post-market surveillance?
They are. I mean, they obviously are supposed to submit vigilance reports to the MHRA when incidents occur in the UK, and they have their own IT system. So obviously, this is part of the diversions away from the EU. So, but obviously, the onus is on the manufacturer to report any safety actions, field safety notices, field safety corrective actions, or product recalls, so in exactly the same way as they would do for the EU. So the only difference is that there's a draft UK PMS regulation that is currently passing through. So they will need to comply with that from July 2024.
Okay, so that's next year.
Yeah, it's expected to enter into law in December this year. But the requirements are very similar to the EU MDR. So it's just that they felt that the requirements and directives didn't go far enough for them.
Okay. Yeah. So, and that will be effective as of July of next year. So it'll go into law at the end of this year and then effective as July. Okay. And then when we're looking at, overall, when we're talking about this idea of making sure you're in compliance with UKCA, are there specific consequences of non-compliance that they've talked about yet? Are there actions, right? We see with the MDR and this idea of UDMED and putting information out there when things are approved and making everything more visible and noticeable. Are there consequences that a manufacturer would face if they're not complying with UKCA requirements?
So, I mean, I think obviously the MHRA would like to move towards having something like UDMED, but the MHRA are they're the ones that designated us. They also enforce the law on medical devices in the UK. So, they investigate any cases of non-compliance that is brought to their attention. And obviously, they have the authority to request for devices to be pulled off the market if there is a serious risk to public health. So obviously, that's all within their control. And also they can ask an approved body that's responsible for issuing a UK certificate to investigate a potential problem with a particular product.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, very similar, right? Similar process and making sure that obviously products that are safe and effective are getting onto the market and making sure that we're controlling, that they're taking care of things that are not. Any other differences that we need to be aware of or think about when we're looking at UKCA versus CE marking? Any differences in the regulations or major things that people should be thinking about as they're, planning for their futures within the EU and the UK?
So there are no real differences because it's based on the MDD. So in some ways, it's a kind of step backwards. But obviously the MHRA and the government are introducing new regulations. So they're starting with the UK PMS regulation, but there will be other regulations very similar to the EU MDR, but with their own special little tweaks. So there was a consultation in 2021, and then last year, in June last year, the government provided a response to that consultation. And currently, there are focus groups that are meeting to kind of iron out all of the details.
Yeah, so more to come as this evolves, right? I think, we
Yeah.
saw this, of course, with the MDR and how long it took for the MDR to go into effect and how many iterations and changes and differences happened. So obviously, things like this don't happen overnight. So there'll be more to come that people should be aware of and keeping their eye out for in terms of regulations that will apply for UK products, correct?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And obviously it's going to be based largely around the EU MDR. So that hopefully that should give manufacturers a little bit of confidence that they're not going to do something completely different for the UK.
Yeah. And I think we should just review one more time for everybody the timelines, right? So if I'm a medical manufacturer and I'm taking a new product to the UK as of today, I am going UKCA. I need to identify an approved body.
Definitely. Yes.
Yes. Or if I'm a manufacturer only submitting products to the UK and not going to the rest of the European Union. So I need to go UKCA as of today. If I'm a medical device manufacturer who has an MDD certificate that exists already for a product or have MDR in the process, I can utilize that extension window,
That's
CE
right.
mark my product until the end of that time and transition sometime within that period.
That's right.
Okay, so we know the deadlines, right? That makes a lot of sense. One thing that came up a lot, of course, with the MDD is this idea that the notified bodies are incredibly backlogged, right? So it's challenging even still, right, as everyone's transitioning through and going to the MDR. With what we're seeing, now we're an approved body. We know that there's others. Are we facing these same kind of challenges yet in terms of backlog? Are we anticipating that there's going to be a big rush, or are we encouraging people to start preparing now, working with manufacturers to start moving in this direction today?
Obviously, the UK-based manufacturers won't necessarily enjoy the extension, so they do need to move first. We've got other manufacturers also. I mean, obviously, with the new UK regulations coming along, if you get in now, you get in under the old regulations rather than the new ones. So your certificate's valid for 5 years. There may be some advantages also in being early to the game, but also some manufacturers have they've got extended transition lines if they've got MDD and MDR certificates, so they might wait. I think it's purely a decision up to the manufacturers. We have got capacity, so so obviously if you want to put your applications in, please go ahead, because we have got capacity at the moment. I think because of the extension to the MDD timelines, it means that some of the work that we were planning, scheduling, has been delayed slightly because manufacturers think they've got more time.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting too, and we've seen a lot of kind of announcements and statements put out about this, right? When they extend these deadlines, it's not to just, keep pushing them out and forward, right? It's really to allow people time to prepare and move towards the transition. It's not, wait up until the last day and then start to try to transition.
I mean, really, it's to allow notified bodies, allow more time for more notified bodies to be designated and allow us to get through our backlog. Manufacturers waiting doesn't really help the situation at all.
Yeah, right. So it's like products they still want medical devices to be placed on the market within the UK, within Europe, right? And it's allowing these extra timeframes so things can process right together as an industry, right? To your point, the notified bodies, the approved bodies, manufacturers all working together. The regulations are new, right? So people are trying to understand what's required and moving forward in the right way together. So if people have questions, of course, they can reach out to us and we're happy to chat with them about their specific situation or their regulatory plan. If they're looking at Europe and the UK at the same time, or just looking at the UK, I'm sure we can answer any questions that they might have. Sharmila, is there anything else you think that people should know about the UKCA, anything to be aware of or things that they should be thinking about as they're putting together their plans?
I'm just begging manufacturers not to have it as an afterthought, that they plan for this right front and center, and they keep on track with the changing regulations, because things are changing in the UK quite quickly.
Yeah, and is all of that information publicly available when things are in draft form or in discussion? Are people able to access that information, or is it only when it's made official and public that someone can see these new upcoming regulations and what will be required?
The draft PMS regulation has been published and that is available. Nothing else is, because obviously they're still discussing the detail of the new regulatory framework. So, but the MHRA obviously has information on the website of how to put products in the market in the UK and about UKCA marking, and obviously approved bodies as well.
Yeah, so be bookmarking that page, reviewing the MHRA page, checking back for updates, since we already know, right? We're aware that there's going to be changes upcoming and new things coming.
You can actually sign up to the MHRA for any news. So that's probably the best way of finding out what's going on.
Yeah, that's a perfect suggestion. We always like to give people tips and tricks because we know, obviously, in the medical industry, it's very complicated in terms of regulations and requirements, and anything that they can do to get more information and stay on top of it. To your point, preparing early, thinking about it on the front end and not as an afterthought will make things much easier from the manufacturer side as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Sharmila, this was so wonderful. It was such a treat to have you on to talk about all things UKCA for medical devices. As I said, if anyone has questions, please feel free to reach out to us. I'm happy to connect you with Sharmila and our team that can support. Thank you so much. Really appreciate having you on. Great discussion.
No, thanks for having me. It's been great talking to you.